Hello and welcome everybody to, according to Andrew, number 96, the Forgotten Depression Lessons. Uh, Today I want to talk about the Forgotten Depression in 1921. There's a lot of similarities between that and 2021, what we're currently looking at, and so I kind of wanted to talk about um, similarities that I saw and stuff like that. I read this book a while ago, so some of it's from memory, some of it's kind of flipping through and kind of checking stuff out. But we'll read directly from the book because I think it's got a couple good quotes, and there's just the author, James Grant, put a lot of good numbers in there, and I wanted to give you those numbers straight up as well, and then I'll get into some of the other stuff. But let's talk about the Depression to begin with. So uh, the way this Depression played out basically is you had the post-war, and the post-war they were determined that the economy was going to crash because you had all this investment and stuff like that, and it was all pulled back. And actually, let me get the numbers for you here. Um, Within 4 weeks of November 11th, 1918 armistice, the War Department had canceled 2.5 billion of its then outstanding 6 billion in manufacturing contracts. For perspective, 2.5 billion represents 3.3% of the 1918 gross national product. In January 1919, commodity prices tumbled. Steel mills, which had hardly been able to keep up with the war-induced demand, now operated at 60 to 65% of capacity. Order books dwindled that of the United States Steel Corporation by 42% when the armistice in May 1919. Not since the panic of 1907 had the great steel giant maker seen the likes of this. But they don't end up seeing a depression, and one of the reasons for this is some pent-up demand, and that's where we kind of get into some of the similarities with 2021. But the Morps and Babison had failed to reckon for the long-thwarted American consumer. Purchases periodically deferred during the year and a half of U.S. belligerency were now exuberantly rung up. War or not, Americans continued to drive their Fords and Chevrolets and Buicks. Now with the peace, people demanded silk shirts, new cars, and a little fun. So that sets us up for what we are looking at right now. So they expect the economic slowdown after World War One, as was typical after wars. They saw one after the American War of 1812 and the American Civil War. Um, as they cancel orders, as I showed. This lag period would induce a recession, at least in theory, be short-lived, as long as there was no debt deflation spiral. I'm not going to touch on debt deflation today just because it gets kind of into the weeds, and I want to keep this focused. However, this did not happen, and this was spurred on by speculative investment as well, which we'll touch on in a moment. As prices across the board soared. A similar thing is happening now. The economy was shut down, and people having an uncertain future incomes-wise were cutting back their spending. Once the economy uncertainty was fixed by businesses reopening, unemployment being instated, people went back to their old spending habits, or in some cases exceeded it by doing projects and held off purchases that the extra time and easy money afforded them. So things like graphics cards have gone through the roof. And electronic components. Part of that is people had to upgrade their systems because they moved home. But another aspect of that is, hey, I just got a check in the mail for $1,000. I didn't really have to do much work for it, and I'm sitting around playing video games. Why don't I upgrade my rig? Uh, so that's an aspect. And then on top of that, a lot of people had projects. I know we made a deck last year, and that was postponed partially because of the soaring lumber prices that happened. But you have this uncertainty in this regard because of this, and then all of a sudden, when that uncertainty is elated, demand surges back, but there's a lag between demand surging back and production getting up and flowing and stuff like that, and that's what this pull system on here with the combine and all that stuff kind of represents, is how that flow happens, and it's not an immediate thing that can bounce back right away. However, all economic activity had been stopped for 2 weeks at least, and the full productive capacity of the economy was not where it was, as many people had not returned to work yet, on top of, supply chains and all that stuff being messed up. As such, demand ate up the supply that was in stock and exceeded the demand, exceeded the supply for the product from pre-shutdown levels, but productive capacity had dropped. So it isn't so much that the money printing that is creating this current inflation that we're experiencing, though it is a factor. It is more the high demand chasing fewer goods. While this phenomenon was partially fueled by the money printing, it will only persist until supply chains get reset and sorted out. And just for comparison's sake, for our current inflation, so um, they always mess with the numbers, but the numbers I could find for inflation in 2020 and 2021. So 2020 was supposedly 1.4%. There's obviously going to be a lag before some of that money kind of enters into the economy and we see rising prices and stuff like that. There's going to be a shortage, and then that shortage is going to drive up prices, things of that nature. So in 2021, we had 6.8%. If we do the CPI for 2021, energy is up 33%. All items are up 4.9%. Food is up 6.1%, and all items major categories up 6.8%. Supposedly. Housing is not in here, and obviously everyone knows if they've been trying to buy a house or looked into the housing costs, those have also gone through the roof. So let us compare that to the inflation rates in the 19 or early 1900s, right? 1919 to 1921. So let me just make sure I got this here. Like there was another spot here. Okay. In 1919, farm income from production reached a new high of 16.9 billion, no less than 125% of the pre-war average of 6.7 billion. This record too would stand until the 1940s. Having money to spend, farmers bought breeding stock as well as tractors. In May 1919, Rag Apple the Great, purebred Holstein Frisian bull fetched heretofore unimagined price of $125,000. Optimistic farmers borrowed to expand. Most land purchases were made with at least a first mortgage recorded on an agricultural historian for that period, and sometimes even a third mortgage, which looked far into the future for liquidation. As alleviating prices for land and crops and breeding stock were signs of the times, and so too were the climbing agricultural mortgage debts. People asked me, said the president of Iowa State Board of Agriculture in December 1919, if I think that this land will stay at this price, $200 to $500 per acre, and I say it certainly will. It may go higher for some time, but I do not think it will go back down. Just a heads up, it goes back down. So we end up getting a crash later on, and none of these people kind of saw it coming, partially because when you're kind of in this situation where you have demand that's fueling more demand kind of thing, it's like if you're gonna buy this product and it costs $20 today, and then it's $30 the next day, and then it's $40 the next day, at a certain point you're like, well, I just got to jump in, like, and there's kind of this constant thing of like, well, I could wait for it to crash or I could jump in, but at a certain point you can't really put your life on hold, right? And that's kind of the situation that I think a lot of Americans now feel and are kind of put in this place where they feel, okay, well, I want the housing crisis or like the current housing bubble to collapse so I can get in a house at an affordable rate. But also at the same time, it's like, how long are you going to wait, right? The first housing crash in 2008, that was like really the first housing crash since the bubble started, and that was way back in the 1950s. So are you going to wait, 70 years, your entire lifetime to hopefully just be able to buy a house? And that's one of those things you got to gamble. Now, our system's kind of in a weird spot where it's getting towards the end of its life, I would say. And so that gamble, in my personal opinion, is worth it, or at least I think it is. And I'm just trying to, make money and save up money as best I can. So that's my philosophy, the way I'm doing it. But, there's the classic adage of the market can stay illogical longer than you can stay solvent. Kind of goes for this, right? Like, this thing can go on longer than you can really kind of afford to stay out of the market, just because you have to have somewhere you're going to live. So one of the things that kind of drives a lot of these issues is some manufacturing processes, and I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. Before we do that, maybe I should touch on what this deflation might look like. So let's see. Um, so in 1920 to 1921, manufacturing wages ended up falling by 22%, and a lot of companies fell out. Auto production fell by 23%. These are all similar things. I don't know about the numbers going on here, but these are going to be similar things to kind of what we're seeing right now. Between 1920 and 1921, average farm disposable income fell by 56.7%, and which is no small agricultural economy which is no small thing when the agricultural economy contributed to 17% and 18% of the national income. Commercial failures were up, all that stuff. But the cutbacks are gonna. People at this time were kind of used to runs on banks and panics and stuff like that. They're not really used to it in our time period. And so I know at the beginning of the pandemic and stuff like that, when people wanted to kind of keep their jobs and stuff was kind of scary, people were willing to take a 10% pay cut or something like that. Now that things are kind of getting back to normal, and wages seem to be rising, are people going to be willing? Are people going to be willing to take the pay cuts that were illustrated in this this book? Where is the pay cut? Oh, that's a different thing. Steel workers of the International Harvester Company ended up taking a pay reduction of 27 to 32% in August for a grand total of 44%. Oh, first they were cut by 20%, and then they were cut by an additional 27 to 32% for a total of 44%. Are people going to put up with that nowadays? I don't know. Because the thing is, like, well, I don't know. People were blowing stuff up back then too. Like, there's a lot of assassinations and things like that going on in this era. So part of me says it would cause instability, and part of me says this era already kind of lived through that. So this one's kind of a hard one to exactly say. But let's now jump into like kind of the manufacturing side, why some of these issues are cropping up right now. So demand will fall off precipitously once supply is fixed. And so this is when you're going to end up seeing your deflationary aspect. And the lumber market's a good indicator of this, but we'll get into that. Uneducated economist uses a great example where if a company needs 20 of a part, and you ask for 20, but because of rationing and because of the short supply, all you can get is 5 of that part maybe, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to put in an order for 100 of that part, and then so that you can get the actual 20 of that part when rationing is done. The thing is, you don't actually need that demand of 100 of that part. And then on top of that, let's say your demand for 100 gets filled. Now we're looking at a really weird situation where this pull system of that and the just-in-time manufacturing no longer works. Because what will happen is now, let's say you ordered that 20, and let's say that 20 usually lasts you 2 weeks before you put in a new order. But now you have 100, right? So you have, instead of 2 weeks worth of demand filled, you have 3 months worth filled, right? Did I do that math right? 2.5 months of demand filled. And so not only are you not going to so they filled that order and they think, oh, okay, well now in 2 weeks or so or something like that, in some interval they're going to put in another order for 100. But not only did they fill that order for 100, you're end up going to be delayed till you end up buying that next order. And this kind of messes things up quite a bit. This is false indicator for manufacturers that there is more demand within the system than there actually was, than there is, as once the firm ordering 100 can get the 20 they actually need over the order, and they will reduce their demand. On top of that, this will end up being sitting in inventory, which is generally something you don't want to do, but due to the disruptions in the supply line and stuff like that, It's a uh, investing capital into your inventory to make it so that your production can keep running. Is most companies are saying that it is a worthwhile trade-off in this current situation, and until things get back to normal, we won't. That is going to really kind of mess up supply lines for a while, because they used to run on this system called just-in-time manufacturing, and that doesn't really work with how things have all been messed up and all this bottlenecking. And so we're getting a lot of oscillations in the system. Let me pull this up real quick. Oh, here we go. Here's the numbers for the depression. So um, here's the Fed rate, and then uh, output fell by 9%, unemployment was 19%, industrial production was down 31%, corporate profits were down 92%, and prices were down 20%. So those were the deflationary aspects in 1921. So this is kind of this oscillation that you're going to see, and I wanted to pull this up for. So imagine this is like supply and demand, and supplies on the top side, demands on the bottom. So right now you have way too much supply and not enough demand, and then as this goes down, you're going to have excessive supply and not enough demand. Oh, crap, go back. And not enough demand, and then it's just going to keep oscillating until, like, each oscillation is going to be less extreme, right? And so we're going to keep oscillating back and forth between having too much supply and not enough demand, and too much demand and not enough supply, and we're going to keep oscillating between those until we eventually kind of level out here. And the reason for that is the fact that companies can't do level building anymore. So level building is basically a manufacturing process in which you have a certain output, and that's how much you output every single day. And generally you have some headroom of capacity, so if some weird thing comes in, it's like, oh, we have this like spike order for whatever reason, you can kind of ramp up production for that gap, fill that gap, and then keep running production and cycle that gap back down when that has passed. The thing is, right now that gap is highly exceeded with the showing demand, but the thing is, it's not as exceeded as it seems, and it might actually not exceeded at all, depending on the situation and what's going on. So going back to the lumber example, there was a glut of lumber after the initial shortage, as either people were priced out of the market or their demand had been filled. But then the sawmill then the sawmill stopped running, and then the prices came back down, and then people started buying again, and then the prices went back up, and then the sawmill had to start running again, but it had been stopped, so then it needed to get running. And so you kind of have this start, stop, where instead it should be just continually turning out certain amounts. And part of that reason is there hasn't been any forecasting, there hasn't been any planning that's been able to happen on the part of these companies, because there's been just so much disruption, and so much of the systems that we had in place were just destroyed overnight, because that won't have any effect on the economy. And so it's going to take a while to get a lot of this stuff rebuilt. It will happen over time, but it's just, you got to negotiate these things. And hey, like, generally, now that we're going into 2022, maybe they've taken the time in 2021 to kind of call ahead to their various manufacturers. Hey, we're starting to get a handle on this. This is what the demand's going to be for 2022. How are you looking? Get a lot of that stuff planned, and now they can start doing level build type stuff. Hopefully. Now, the thing that gets a wrench thrown into this whole thing is the debt system, or the debt situation in most of these companies. What's going on with that? If they overpredicted overall demand, and then they overproduce again, and have this whole issue where maybe the raw materials people are starting to get a handle on things, but then the end manufacturers way overshoot their target in terms of where they think demand and all that stuff is going to be. So it's just kind of one of those things that's in a interesting spot. Now, reasons that we might not see a deflationary system right now is mainly because back then they had a gold-backed currency, which kind of was gold-backed. So our current system, until Nixon took us off in the 1973, was everyone used dollars to back their currency, and then the dollar was backed in gold. So before that happened, the same system was basically in place, except for it was with the pound. So the pound was backed in gold, and then everyone else's currency was backed in the pound. Then after World War II, that switched to the U.S. dollar because the U.S. was the king after that, the lead empire. So that's one thing that might limit it. Also, the Fed at the time had a actual deflationary policy that they were running, and so that isn't something they have basically done ever since. They've always been working towards an inflationary policy. Now, it doesn't really matter because the Fed has literally no control of that. In this case, they kind of did because they could restrict or loosen the controls on gold via interest rates and where things would flow. But with today's modern debt deflation or debt-based economy, basically the way money gets created is when you go into a bank and ask for a loan and they give you the loan. That just creates the money out of thin air. So the Fed doesn't really have much control at all over how the system can actually run. They're just kind of there to be the fall guy in a sense. Okay, I think that covers all the stuff I wanted to with this. So just to kind of wrap up, so in 1921 they expected a depression and they got surging hot market. In 2021 we expected a depression due to people's financial instability at the time and the lockdown, and instead we got fire hot market shortly after, maybe like after a delay of about a month. Then they saw soaring prices and said inflation's here to stay and things are never going to turn back, until they immediately did, and things started to nosedive. Debt started to spiral out of control, and people owed all this money that they couldn't pay back. Even Henry Truman was kind of caught up in this whole thing, interestingly enough. Who was Henry Truman, as in the president of the United States, Henry Truman, after FDR died. So he ended up having a similar issue. We're going to experience a similar thing where people have way too much debt currently in the system. They took as far as I can tell, they took their checks from unemployment, and they could have done it to pay off their debts, and I'm sure some people did. I know I did, but a lot of people didn't, and a lot of people, especially when you add on to the fact that there was people that had their mortgages frozen and all that stuff, they had a lot more disposable income at that moment. And if you're not thinking long term and things like that, it can be like, oh, now I can go enjoy myself, now I can do and that mentality has been kind of bred over the coming years because of kind of an inflationary situation, and also just general short-sightedness of, I have to enjoy myself now because things are getting worse and worse and worse within America. So if I don't enjoy it now, I'm never going to kind of get it. There's that kind of mentality. I know I feel it from time to time. So I'm assuming other people are similar in that regard. But yeah, 1921, there's some similarities, there's some differences, but ultimately we will see how things play out. Hopefully you guys found this informative. If you have any questions, write them down in the comments. I'm on YouTube, I'm on BitChute, I'm on Podbean and all other podcasts. I'm on the Apple and Spotify and all that stuff, Google podcasts. So you can find me there. Leave me a comment and I'll respond to it, or if it's an insightful question, maybe it'll spur another podcast. So please let me know. Thank you guys for having a good day. This has been According to Andrew, and goodbye.